right, welcome back, Consumer Law 101 viewers. We are here today on our seventh video in our advanced series. This video is entitled The Truth About 1099s and Charge-Offs and How to Get Them Removed. I'm your courts instructor, as always, Attorney Aaron Swift, Swift Law North LLC's CEO and Managing Partner. Today we are talking about the truth about 1099s and how to get them and debt forgiven and removed, if possible. We're going to go into a lot more depth than when I talked about some of the introductory terms and how they overlapped with some financial terms in earlier videos. Then we're going to talk about the truth about charge-offs. And again, vice versa, we're going to talk about them a lot more in detail than I have before. And then lastly, as always, some consumer best practices. Okay, so the truth about 1099s. 1099s on their own do not impact debts or indebtedness. And that seems very contradictory because there's a 1099 specifically called a 1099-C that has to be issued if a creditor forgives debt over $600. And what is supposed to happen then is the consumer files taxes based upon that 1099. Now, 1099s, the rules, they only must be sent in certain circumstances based upon taxable events. I'm not going to go into them a whole bunch of detail, but basically, again, the ones we care more about in this space are 1099-Cs. That's if there's forgiveness or cancellation of debt of 600 more. You might be familiar with like 1099 MISCs for certain incomes and other things, but 1099-C, again, even on its own, does not necessarily mean that a debt is not owed. In a limited circumstance, and it's both circumstance, if both instances or factors of this circumstance, if a 1099-C is issued and it can be proven and shown that the consumer claims that 1099-C income amount as income and pays taxes appropriately, then most courts determine a debt is no longer owed. Again, that's most courts, and there's no legal advice provided in these educational tools, so you won't have to check your jurisdiction and your circuit. But if a 1099-C issued on its own doesn't extinguish a debt, it's only issued because of a taxable event. But then if the consumer takes a contradictory position, basically reports it as income, and then suffers because of that contradictory position, pays taxes accordingly, then it can be argued that the debt is not owed. In that case, a 1099-C can be a very powerful tool for us, but those conditions have to be met and you have to be in the right jurisdiction. Because if those conditions are met and you're in the right place, then it can be argued, again, the debt's not owed. So if they're reporting a debt with a balance, and it can be a lot of leverage, if so, with an ultimate lawsuit to get it removed. All right, the truth about charge-offs. I went in this in some detail before again, but I want to go into some greater detail because this is probably the most misunderstood, maybe with 1099s. Charge-offs are probably the most misunderstood, the most misrepresented, the most mislabeled, the most misinformation spread about online. A lot of scams, a lot of scam artists, a lot of people who know better and are lying, and a lot of people who don't know better and are misinformed and misguided. A charge-off is an action taken by a creditor when they have written off the account or the debt as a loss or bad debt. And in that case, they must close the account for future charges. There can be two types of charge-offs, an internal charge-off and an external charge-off. An internal charge-off, the lender has, on its own decision, decided that the debt's no longer collectible. Usually does so after a delinquency and certainly after a default. But that could be after one mispayment, two mispayments, three mispayments. Again, lenders can make internal decisions about when they want to write off an account or debt as bad debt. In that instance, they close the account, usually begin some internal debt collection efforts, but maybe even outsource it to a third-party debt collector. But at that stage, they still own the debt, and the debt is still owed. That is so critical, so important to understand here because there's so much misinformation in the space about what a charge-off is. A charge-off does not mean the debt is not owed. So let's now, pivot to an external charge-off. This is a required action with certain types of accounts, usually open-ended accounts like a credit card. If a debt falls delinquent more than 180 days, so over 6 months, then the lender must close the account and must no longer report it as an asset, but must now report it as a loss. That is a 100% requirement. And it's basically between the IRS and the lender and its shareholders, really, because they can no longer represent that as an asset. It's definitely a bad, uncollectible loss. Now, after an external charge off, there can be some collection, but usually then there's a sale of it to some debt buyer down the line. Again, this is so critical. That does not mean the debt is not owed, even if there's an external charge off. No matter the type of charge off, the charge off as an indicator alone does not mean that the debt is not owed. It does not mean that the debt cannot be credit reported, and it does not mean there should be a $0 balance. Now, at the same time, a charge off does mean that an account must be closed, and the lender creditor can no longer charge certain types of fees and interest. That can be powerful for us. Just remember how we can use the 1099 as leverage to get things removed. Because if the 1099-C is issued, again, I'm going backwards a little bit, and the consumer has filed taxes, claimed the 1099-C as income, and paid taxes accordingly, now we can dispute whether that debt is owed and how it should be credit reported. Similar here. The charge off on its own does not mean we can automatically dispute because it's allowed. Even multiple instances, if it's payment history shows a C, C, C for charge off, charge off, charge off for many, many, many months in a row, courts find that's accurate as long as the status is a true status of charged off at that time. But we can use it to our advantage if you know these basics, if you know these rules, because what we're going to look for is after a charge off, is the account listed as closed and not open? Are there additional interest still being charged and fees? That happens a lot. You cannot do that after a charge off because you're closing the account, you're no longer accepting payments. And there's other federal laws, the Fair Credit Billing Act and Truth in Lending Act and other regulations, Reg Z, that if you're going to continue to charge interest and fees, you have to send statements, but you only do that on open accounts. So it's this kind of um, mixing and matching between these different federal laws that basically say, okay, once certain types of debt, open-ended credit, like credit cards in particular, once they go 6 months past due, you have to charge it off, even if you don't want to. It's uncollectible at that point. In most cases, it's sold to a debt buyer, but even if it's just an internal charge off, the debt is still owed and it can be credit reported, but it has to be done so correctly. That's where we get our leverage from. That's where we're going to get a lot of deletions because they're going to make mistakes on what they do with the charge off after they charge it off or after they're supposed to charge it off. And if they don't follow what they're supposed to do, that is challengeable. You're going to hear a lot in later videos about how to best dispute, the disputing process, and even with our best lawyer drafted templates in the Pro Series. But just understand there are ways to get 1090 ways to use 1099s to get information removed, and then ways to get charge offs removed as long as it's based on factual inaccuracies. And now we're going to know what that means. Okay, so I just talked about this before I switch slides, but how do we use charge? How do we get them removed? Just go back to the basics. What's accurate? We're going to review across all of the available CRA reports. Remember, we've talked about the big three. We might want to pull additional ones like SageStream, Clarity. If a debt is charged off or if it should be charged off, we're going to look about how it's credit reported. And is that credit reporting also consistent with debt collection efforts? If there's a different balance in two places, that's going to be a problem. But also we're going to look, is a charge off reported as closed? Is it reported as, no more interest and late fees being assessed, so the balance shouldn't be increasing? Those are things that happen enough where if you're educated, if now you come from the foundation of knowing what to look for, now we can use that to fight back. Again, we're going to dispute, and then sue. So consumer best practices. It's just so important to understand what these terms actually mean. There's so many falsehoods about these two concepts online, and videos and TikTok videos and interview style, flashy, outlandish claim based videos with certain credit repair experts, so to speak. They have misleading information about what 1099s are and do, and a lot of misinformation about charge-offs. Just simply put, charge-offs do not automatically mean that the debt's not owed and that it cannot be credit reported. But if we can find FCRA violations that come after 1099s when certain conditions are met, or if we find FCRA violations based upon inconsistent or incorrect reporting related to charge-offs, then we can fight back. We can dispute, we can eventually sue, hopefully put thousands of dollars in your pocket on top of fixing the problem. And then again, if prevailed, we make the bad guys pay us. So as always, if you'd like more educational content, more information, certainly the next series of videos, the Pro Series, have a lot more in-depth content and come with our template letters that we certainly advise consumers to use if they want to go at it on their own. If not, a consumer that doesn't want to necessarily go at it on their own, if you think you have a disputable issue or a issue under the FDCPA or the FCRA, visit us at swiftlawnorth.com. Again, educational side, consumerlaw101.com. Litigation side for issues related to errors, harassment, abuse, swiftlawnorth.com. Thank you.